Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now. All right, check-ins. So I'm doing check-ins at the beginning of these just to kind of ground myself in authenticity. So right now, I'm feeling really plugged in the moment, feeling really calm, but then there's just like a little bubbling up of anxiety, maybe 5-10% anxiousness, which just kind of dropped to 7. So today we have Zach Stein. He's back at the Stoa, and Zach is going to give kind of share his thoughts on metapolitics, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A and how the Q&A is going to look like. If you have a question for Zach, just write it in the chat box and I will unmute you and you can just ask your question to Zach. Or if you want me to read your question on your behalf, I will do so. And I will be warming Zach up with a few questions. So that being said, I'll hand it over to Zach to share your thoughts on metapolitics.
Thank you, Peter. And it's actually great to be back. I like this because there's so many of you. It's like a classroom. It's much more engaging than one-on-one. So I'll share a few thoughts. Before I get in, I do just want to take a moment to just recognize the continuing difficulty of the overall situation and the suffering, the pain, and especially the invisible or the unseen, or all the stories that aren't being shared, that we don't know, that don't show up on the news feeds. So there's so much of that right now. Excuse me, and probably a lot of that even in the background of everyone's consciousness, that everyone knows someone who is in pain right now. And so you just can't jump into the business as usual, give your talk kind of thing in this context. So I just want to take a moment to just presence all that in the background. And to kind of clarify what I'm trying to do, which is to say some things into that to help us grapple with that and to move through it, as I said last time, to find a way to create cultural resources that could allow us to become post-tragic in our relationship to this. So that is said. The thing I want to speak about is a set of ideas that came to me last year, which basically were the result of me getting so disgusted with political discourse in the United States, and particularly on social media, that I wanted to find a way to be a conscientious objector from the culture wars. And it occurred to me that the things that I was most concerned about, education, psychology, metaphysics, and some of the things that I was tracking, like existential risk and civilizational collapse and measurement, specifically measurement as an aspect of a planetary computational stack. I'm going to get to that. And then the transfiguration of human nature in the meta-modern moment, these three things, I always thought that these had political implications, but of course I couldn't actually speak to them within the context of the culture war without being co-opted by a particular mimetic tribe, specifically the left-right meta tribes. And so I started thinking, well, I'm actually interested in something else. And this term metapolitics came to mind. And so I began to research the notion of metapolitics. And there's some previous work done, which I plug into in my blog posts. But so if politics is what counts as politics, which is to say, elections, voting, representative democracy, two-party system with candidates that are paid for. So that's politics. Facebook, arguing with your friends on Facebook about presidential campaigns, that's politics. This is what I'm talking about, politics. There's other definitions, like if you're at work and there's competition for a spot and you're in political competition with your colleague. So that's another kind of politics. But I'm talking about politics, capital P, American politics. Like, do you hate Trump or not? Is it politics? Politics as usual, right? That those forms of modern politics, specifically the left-right division, they're being transected by metapolitical vectors that are beginning to obsolete them. And so these are the things that I was detecting, which made me so frustrated with contemporary political discourse, as many of us are, because it's actually non-capacitative, can't deal with reality. And in some ways, it's almost designed to be a simulation that runs interference between you and reality. So when reality starts to actually interface again with the political structure itself gets put in brackets. And this has already been happening with things like global warming, right? Or climate change, right? So this is a hyper object. This is one of the best ways into metapolitics is to think about the notion of a hyper object. You guys know Timothy Morton's term, the hyper object. It's very interesting. And, but, you know, politics is great when you're dealing with regular old objects, things that can be predicted, things that can be measured and understood the way populations used to be before social media, for example. But as soon as you get the digital emergence of a planetary, financial, and cultural meta system, you get a hyper object of the capitalist world system. So complicated, it can't be understood. You also get scientific hyper objects like climate change. Again, so big, such a massively distributed, complex process that we can't be understood. Now, so the hyper object is the thing that makes politics be like, uh-oh, we actually need to find a new way to make decisions and choices because our cognitive apparatuses are being humiliated by the hyper objects. And now don't confuse a hyper object with something that's not a hyper object. So for example, pre-modern man, right, encountered nature, right? Overwhelmingly complex beyond their perception and in many ways ineffable, not a hyperobject. Hyperobject's very specific. A hyperobject requires the exhaustion of scientific apparatus. That the hyperobject is the conclusion of the best scientific attempts and actually where science leads us up and out of what's comprehensible and into the massively complex processes like totalized planetary ecological change, right? Which is occurring on time cycles that are centuries long and kind of data points that are innumerable and increasingly complex. So the hyperobject of climate change is one of the things that a la Extinction Rebellion and others are getting people to be like, whoa, politics is in brackets right now. Politics, the way we think it could work to solve a problem and engaging a hyperobject, politics doesn't work that way. We need to actually rethink at a foundational level what it means to do politics, right? And what's interesting is you can reduce the actually metapolitical to the political, and then you get the politicization of climate science, right? You're trying to fit something that's actually not capturable within the conceptual framework of politics as usual. You're trying to make it fit, right? And so you start to opportunize and politicize climate science, for example. So you can see there's many horizons of hyperobjects that are kind of looming over the political space and making us quite nervous. And of course, the pandemic is a hyperobject. Right. Now, a virus is not necessarily a hyperobject, right? In a controlled environment with the right things, we can come to basically understand with scientific apparatuses the nature of viruses. Now, we can't predict their mutations, which will always be complex for virology and immunology, and specifically vaccines. We can't predict the mutations, but we can know that it's going to mutate. We can know the rate of mutation. We can know the rate of contagion. So the virus is not a hyperobject, right? But the pandemic is a hyperobject. It's got massively, massively complex set of interrelated moving pieces. And so just like climate change or, the total kind of planetary economic system, cultural system, as I described it, the sublime, overwhelming complexity of the totalized capitalist world system, right? Beyond comprehension. Then you throw something else in, which is a pandemic, which ends up being itself a hyperobject. All of these things are exhausting the capability of politics as usual. And this is why it's so fucking scary, if I can speak that way. So the fears we have of authoritarian clampdown, those come from our awareness that we're dealing with a hyperobject and that we're in the metapolitical, right? That there would be attempts to suspend politics as usual, right? That's when we know we're in a grappling with the metapolitical. So what this means is that all the attempts to discuss this in terms of the categories of politics as usual mean you've been captured, that your mind's been captured, probably by social media. Right? So you're missing the point if you're distracted by the left-right division here. And you're missing the point if you're in the blame game and media spectacle of politics as usual. And so Facebook has become politics as usual, which is worth noting. The targeted political advertisements, micro-targeted political advertisements, are part and parcel now of the process of political campaigning and voting. And so it also means that the degree to which you are swayed emotionally and swayed in opinion formation by the dynamics of your engagement with Facebook's in terms of politics as usual also means you're captured, right? We can't see clearly the hyperobject looming over all of our lives, infiltrating like right down to the everyday details of our lives. This hyperobject gets in there, as they all do, as climate change does, as the political economy of the whole planet does, right? The hyperobjects haunt us and are moving us out of the political and into the metapolitical, and eventually to redefine the political. That politics as usual ends up being yesterday's. And we can't use those categories to handle this problem, just like we can't use those categories to handle existential risk and civilizational collapse. And we can't use those problems to handle the measurement metastructure that characterizes the totalized planetary computational stack. I'll get to that. And we can't use them to handle the dynamics of human nature itself, which is changing at the biological and technological level. Those are the three aspects that I laid out in my blog posts that had me moving into the metapolitical. And now the pandemic has us all moving into the metapolitical and asking foundational questions about what it means to cooperate, why we cooperate, what are the best ways to distribute the shared fruits of our social collaboration, right? What are the responsibilities of personhood? What are the responsibilities of a government? How is collective choice making carried out? Under the conditions we're in, we're again addressing these foundational questions and worrying about what's going to happen in November when we're supposed to go stand in line in very crowded buildings and vote. But we all need to be coming together and actually working on a design problem. The entire population is working on a design problem, which is the problem of the future. But instead, we're going to take a multiple choice test and vote for a couple futures that have been laid out for us by people who never actually talked to us about it. So, yeah. So that's the kind of intro where you look at the way the metapolitical becomes salient because of the hyper objects, which are kind of, these are the things that are in some ways characteristic of the meta-modern historical epoch, which is a brief epoch, which we are in, but which will end as we usher in a new world. So this is the time between worlds, is the meta-modern epoch, and it's when we first get a sense of the fact that science brings us up and into its own exhaustion in confrontation with the hyper objects. And that means, whoa, go down this, whoa, we can't do politics. If science doesn't give us what we need, how does politics work, right? The whole modern emergence, that from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment into modernity, and you get this complex of science and politics and the removal of church and state, and this whole thing required that we didn't end up at the end of the day with these hyper objects. So, all right, so that's the first move. And then the second one gets us into these aspects that were already in the atmosphere around us, that were already metapolitical, right? So the first one we can all get, which is existential risk and civilizational collapse. And this is kind of my collaborations with Schmachtenberger and Hall were in this vein, which is that this is actually unprecedented. Like, modern politics wasn't actually designed to handle planetary, right? Modern national politics weren't designed to handle planetary scale problems of civilizational collapse dynamics and potential existential risk. And again, this is what makes us nervous about things like eco-fascism, right? That, okay, there's something that is so big and complex that surrounds our political systems that if the environment got crazy enough, you could see how we would just suspend politics as usual and do something quite bad in the name of environmental protectionism, right? So that sense that, a planetary scale-wide risk can't be handled by national politics as usual. So we're already kind of aware of that. And similarly with the pandemic, right? It used to be that plagues were not existential risks, right? Because they were geospatially, they were isolated, right? Even the plagues in Europe, it was like it got bad and it came over from China and stuff, but like the Native Americans were not aware that there was a plague in Europe. It took a long time for those germs to cross over. But we're in a situation now, it's becoming abundantly clear with the complexity of the travel infrastructures and the amount of travel happening, that the total enclosure of the civilization on the planet is basically complete, so that a pandemic is planetary from square one. And so, so it's worth noting that's not something that can be handled by politics as usual. It actually requires a radical international collaboration. And similarly, pandemics in the past, if you look at like during the 30 Years' War, for example, in Europe, always brought along with it economic, political turmoil, violence, war, depressions, or the equivalent in medieval terms. And, but again, localized. Like the 30 Years' War, it was in Europe. It didn't, and it was in a sense a world war, but it didn't implicate all the continents in the way that the world wars we know did. So similarly here, you're looking at the second, third order, fourth order effects of the pandemic being planetary in the ripples that spread out. And so we've always known that these issues that I'm discussing, the civilizational collapse dynamics and planetary risk scenarios, kind of obsolete politics as usual. The pandemic is reminding us of that. Another thing I discuss in my metapolitical blog posts is the notion of a planetary scale measurement metastructure that is wedded to a computational stack that's also of planetary scope. And so what this means is basically we're about to measure everything and basically track it all. And we're already trying to do that. So the Internet of Things is a very popular phrase. And it basically is this way of characterizing the massively complex sensor network and tracking devices that would allow us to basically log the entire economy and all economic transactions, including shipments and things, in a computer. Basically, it's a simple way to say it. It's actually a massively distributed computational stack, as talked about by Benjamin Bratton. But what most people are kind of missing here is that the sharp end of the stick when it comes to that planetary computational stack is actually the measurement infrastructures that are nestled right up next to us. And that includes like your Facebook psychometric profile backend that feeds you the micro-targeted advertisements. And it's going to include the contact tracing networks. And it's going to include the biomedical infrastructures, specifically the biometric infrastructures that are rolling out in the wake of the pandemic. So it's always been the groundwork. The groundwork's always kind of been there, but the whole population is now becoming aware that there's this possibility that we're all going to be hyper measured, hyper tracked, and logged in forever the kind of vast memory store of the planetary computational stack. And so that is one of these other things that we worry about, and we're starting to hear it now with in the context of the pandemic, is the totalized surveillance apparatus that is basically ready to go. Already been used by large swaths of capitalism. Again, mostly to sell you things, but soon to be used by nation states. And so this is important, that the measurement structures put in place to handle with the pandemic are going to be very complex. They already are. And medical measurement is now being put in a spotlight, and it's interesting to see because I've been studying measurement and measurement infrastructures for about 10 years now, starting with standardized testing in schools, but looking across a bunch of fields. And medical testing has been a mess for a very long time before the pandemic shined a spotlight on it, which is to say, like, anyone who gets a virus of any kind has an individualized reaction to it, right? Anyone who takes a medical test of any kind has an individualized reaction to it. Rates of medical measurement error are largely undocumented, but the points within medical measurement systems for which error could occur are so numerous that we know there's high medical measurement error in normal contexts, right? So measurement itself ends up being one of these kind of like niceties, or like a thorn in the political, which is an allusion to the metapolitical, which is to say the measurements are supposedly where the social system contacts reality, right? The measurement is where the social system contacts reality. But what about the measurement error? And we're going to be thinking about that in a very detailed way. And anyone who studies metrology, which is the fields concerned with making and testing measurement instruments, you know that measurement error is part of measurement. It just is. And if you're building an instrument, you can actually study how the error works, which is to say you can come to be knowing something about where and why errors occur with your measurement instrument. Charles Sanders Peirce, one of my heroes. Some of you will know him. I'm not going to get into it. He was a metrologist. So some of this I got from him, and then working with Theo Dawson, who was a psychometrician at Lectica, come to learn about, oh yeah, whenever you're using a measurement instrument, it's so important to also have part of the discourse about it be about the nature of its errors, right? The error bars, confidence intervals around the point. And so where's the discussion of that in medical measurement? Pre-pandemic, you go to a functional medicine doctor, They're going to take like $10,000 worth of tests. And do you ever have a discussion about the forms of measurement error that accompany those tests? Right? No is the answer. And if you're in a normal medical context, not a fancy functional medicine context, just a normal medical context, when are you discussing medical errors with doctors, right? Lyme's disease tests cost thousands of dollars. Medical measurement error is ubiquitous. So false positives, false negatives in diagnostics were already an issue in medical testing. Now we're going to look at it. But we're also wedding those medical diagnostics for the first time to socio-political structures, right? Which means that there's a political content now engaged with that medical measurement error question. Before it was just about, am I sick and what do I have? Now it's about, can I travel? Am I free of quarantine, right? Am I a stigmatized citizen, right? So we're running this very delicate line up and into a biometric infrastructure that's political and moved up and into a larger surveillance apparatus of the totalized planetary computational stack. So there's that. And then the final vector, which I mentioned in the blog post and is also relevant here, is the nature of personhood and the transformations of personhood that are accompanying us through this time between worlds. And just like the modern politics, as usual, can't handle this, the modern identity structure also can't handle this. The modern self, right, which is different from the medieval self, let's say, which is different from the like ancient self or archaic self. I'm not going to go into the whole theories of cultural evolution and how these things are encased within each identity structure uniquely, but the modern self was a thing that was distinct. You were autonomous. You were a citizen. You voted and you used reason. And then eventually you became this self-interested, rational, economic actor of fiction. But these assumptions of personhood, which characterize the modern person, are also breaking down. And the kind of viscous solution of the kind of meta-modern cultural landscape, a kind of white noise of oversaturation and kind of semiotic hyper-confusion has slowly dissolved the core of the sovereign modern self. So what this means is that we are in a schizophrenic or psychotic moment as a culture where we don't know what it means to be a person anymore. And that is metapolitical. Because what it means is that it all comes down, the whole political structure, all the modernity political structure comes down to the individual, right? Specifically the blank slate individual, as Patrick Ryan talked about here on the Stoics the other day. And so you're looking at, and postmodernity was signaling this, but they had no way of actually embodying it because they were academics working in modern academic institutions, making a lot of money, critiquing modernity as a writer. So they were a modern self talking about the end of the modern self. The modern self has actually ended. We are now in the confusion of trying to become a new kind of person or a new kind of human. And so that means that a lot of us look out at the modern political structure and think, well, this doesn't make sense. This might have made sense in the 1950s or the 1970s when there was a certain kind of cohesion to the modern person, the modern family, the modern kind of like life trajectory through these phases, et cetera. But now, so you wonder why the youth don't vote, you know? It's because they know this system wasn't designed for them. It was designed for their grandparents, basically. So that's the final metapolitical bit, which is also broad to a head with the pandemic, which is that as we reflect on the suffering and the death, and as we reflect on the economic precarity and the complete intertwinement of all the people on the planet in this event, right? We wonder what it means to be an isolated, abstract individual. Like, how can that be? Like, I did nothing. I didn't choose any of this. It's all happening to me. And yet also my individual choice to go out or not go out somehow could have, through exponential like spreading, like I could cause thousands of people to die just by making the wrong choice. So there's this weird breakdown in intertwinement and kind of like, wiping away in the sand, like the mandala of the modern self, just like blowing the sand mandala of the modern self, like off the thing. And so here we are, figuring out what to do with politics as usual, which is going to stick around. And they still have the guns and they still have the money, as Jim Morrison would say. But we have the numbers and are actually living in reality, whereas they're working basically to try to create simulations of it that will be useful to control us. So it's interesting to consider, what does metapolitical practice look like in the context of politics as usual? And the opportunity now with, as I mentioned last time, the time between worldsness and the battle in heaven, which is part of this new personhood story. Metapolitical practice ends up being right at home, right with your speech and how you spend your time, and specifically how you engage or do not engage with politics as usual. So there's something about when the metapolitical dawns and everyone starts to see that we're bracketing politics as usual, it's a risky moment. Because one of the things politics does is it sublimates open conflict. It's like, we're not going to actually fight. We're going to do this thing called politics. But when politics is in brackets and you know that, well, the given political structure actually can't solve this problem, then you kind of take the gloves off, right? And you're trying to get down to brass taxes and actually change something, fix something. So there's a delicacy here, which means that politics will actually become more heated. And here I'm going to use the broader term of politics, which means that like collegial politics is going to become crazy. Spouse-husband politics, gender politics, like all of that's going to become really intense, and with the possibility to totally change, which is to say that we're going to have to get real with one another and actually start bracketing politics in those contexts too, and getting to the reality of what we're both, or what we are all together confronting. The metapolitical is usually an invitation to change the nature of conversation, to talk about something that's real instead of remaining in the simulation of politics as usual. And that works in all these levels, from like the husband-wife through the like work relationship up into politics as we know it. So expect to actually, in context where normally you'd be politicking, expect to be able to put that aside and actually have a conversation, maybe for the first time in a while. And that's metapolitical practice. So I'll leave it at that and take some questions.
So if you have any questions, just write in the chat box. If you want me to read it on your behalf, just indicate that. And I'll warm up Zach with a question. It's like, oh man, it's so much like juiciness. I could geek out with you on this all day. So there's two questions that feel alive to me, and I don't know which one to go with. One is about mimetic mediation and this term, psychodynamic is political, or the psychodynamic is political. And the other question is about Richard Spencer. So which one do you think feels most alive there?
I have no idea.
maybe we'll crowdsource it. Um, okay, so Richard Spencer, you started that article, the first one on the Metapolitics, mentioning that you discovered that term from Richard Spencer. If I recall, I think he got it from the dissident right in the European movement, the dissident right European movement. And I was thinking while you were talking, it's like, he is so, and I think he is earnest in his belief on white nationalism, but he's so outside the Overton window with that. It's like he almost had to get creative and go metapolitical in a way. Um, so I'm curious, and this might get to like inside baseball with the culture war stuff, but I'm curious how you think the dissident right role played in kind of putting this, question at the forefront.
Yes, I mean, that is where I first encountered the term, in the lips of a white nationalist who was also what you call like a race survivalist, like Bannon, right? So there was an awareness after 1972, again, that we were going to be looking at a situation where nation states were going to begin to lose sovereignty, and we're going to have a lot of very complex ecological and economic dynamics. And some conservatives said, okay, let's drop the charade of modern politics, that there's a blank slate and that everyone's useful, and actually just say what we've been saying behind closed doors for a long time among the aristocrats, and just say it openly, which is that we're looking out for those like ourselves when the shit hits the fan on a planetary scale. And so this was the metapolitical vector that Spencer and Bannon and others speak into, which is that, we're questioning one of the foundational assumptions of modern politics, and specifically late modern politics, and saying that race is actually relevant in a different way than you think it is to doing politics. And so, and that's why there's so much nervousness around Trump, around Bannon, around the new authoritarianism, because in a sense, they're a little bit more aware than the kind of well-behaved left in the blue church. These guys are actually a little bit more aware that the metapolitical moment is ripe, and that shit's about to get real, and we need to be prepared for that. And so, yes, that's one of the reasons I wanted to start thinking about getting more progressive people more explicitly embracing metapolitical practice, which is a reconceiving of what it means to do politics, rather than a figuring out how to win at what has counted as politics, right? And now, I obviously do not support Spencer or Bannon in any way, but I do think that they've caught a lot of people off guard, right? Like Trump won because these guys caught the blue church completely off guard. There's many other reasons, of course, but so it's important to just think that, you want to like put it in stark terms, like the bad guys are already going metapolitical, right? So we need to figure out what it would mean for the good guys to start making metapolitical practice primary objective, as opposed to the good guys trying to win according to the rules of the old system.
Yeah, and if we had more time, I would inquire into the good guy, bad guy terminology. But let's go to the questions. And Jacob, you had a question.
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. So I was wondering, I'm not exactly sure what it is that I'm looking for here, but I felt like there was some thing that could be drawn out when Zach was talking about the blowing away of the modern self, San Mandala, and the ideas of the pre-tragic and post-tragic, and kind of what he talked about with Andrew Sweeney and in the last chapter of his book, which is awesome. Yeah, feel free to just riff on that, but that's what I feel like is going to be the most interesting.
Yeah, And it's the metapolitical kind of like issue that I work on the most is just this question of the nature of personhood and the changing nature of personhood and the lingering kind of like misidentification so many of us have with the modern identity, with the modern self, that we're often taught in schools and taught by our parents and others to like be that modern self. That's what it means to be successful. But life conditions are such that we know that this is not the case, that a new form of personhood has been emerging, specifically since digital became ubiquitous, but was already emerging before then. One way to think about it is under the notion that Hall uses of sovereignty, right? That the modern self was autonomous, right, in the Kantian sense, ideally. But the self that's emerging, if there is to be a future, needs to be a sovereign self, which is different and requires a different political apparatus to hold it and utilize it. That the sovereign self is threatening to traditional modern structures, but the sovereign self is the very energy that the future political structures need to figure out a way to run on, right? So this is that distributed intelligence versus like complicated, hierarchical, modern machine intelligence. So that's some of it. Sometimes Gaffney and I talk about a unique self symphony, right? That the kind of homogenized or standardized, differentiated modern self, which is like you're a non-unique demographic category with this much weighting in terms of how much your vote counts and et cetera. Whereas the system we're looking at ends up being one that has uniqueness as a factor, which is the best way to do sense making actually, is with unique vectors of input as opposed to like standardized vectors of input. That's another conversation. So unique nodal points, and then each unique nodal point comes together with other unique nodal points, and you get what we've called a unique self symphony. And that's kind of a term of art, but there's other ways to think about it. The mystical body of Christ, the corpus mysticum. There's another way to think about it. The kingdom of ends, that the kingdom of nature becomes the kingdom of ends. So it's been an idea that's been implicit in the Western tradition, that there's something beyond the kind of like isolated, abstracted individual, and there's something that actually weaves everyone together into a greater whole. So yeah, we're breaking out of the prior structures. Yeah, so I think that was a kind of a strange, rambling answer, but it was an open question, so I just kind of took it.
Amy, you got a question about outlaws?
I have a question about outlaws. I was in one of your texts, I read that you cited Wilbur's idea that outlaws need better laws, and I've been thinking a lot about Wilbur's idea about post-conventionality in response to conventionality or anti-conventionality, that we need to start acting in a way that is more in right relationship with what is actually going to keep humans alive and sovereign. So I was wondering what the idea of maybe a sovereign or an outlaw metapolitical landscape might look like in 10 years from now, if everything went the way you would want it to. What would that look like?
I mean, there's a lot in there. The distinction Ken made, I believe this was like in the 80s. He made a distinction between the There's the law-abiding people, right? And there's the outlaws. And he was talking about paradigmatically. He's like scientists and other people within paradigms. There's the people who follow the rules, and then there are people who break the rules, right? But of the people who break the rules, he differentiated them. He said there's pre-law, law, and trans law, right? So some people break the rules because they can't even follow them. They don't know how to follow them. They don't respect them. They don't even want rules. They just break the rules because they're pre-law, right? Other people break the rules because they're like, yeah, I get your rules. I can do your rules all day, and I've done them for a while, but I'm looking for better rules, right? So you break the law in the name of the higher law. And this is actually, again, something deep in the Western esoteric tradition. The Lion of Judah, right? The archetype of Judah, which is the archetype of David and the Messiah, and etc. The whole notion there was that new prophecy is possible, that the law of the Talmud can be followed plus one, that you can break the law in the interests of establishing higher law. This is like deep in the tradition. And so similarly here, this is what Wilber's getting at. He's getting at the trans law, which is the righteous outlaw, not the renegade outlaw who's self-interestedly breaking the law in the interest of no law but his own self-preservation, but rather the post-conventional, like righteous outlaw who's attempting to establish a higher order law or a better law or a more just form of law. And so that's very important set of distinctions, and it can be applied in any domain. So it's like there are some people who propagate conspiracy theories and things about the virus and stuff like that, and they're negating normative laws of thought, right? Like, that's just some crazy shit. Like, that's, you're breaking the law of reason when you say these things, right? But they're saying, no, I'm trans-rational, right? I'm above reason, and you're stuck in reason, and you can't see how this crazy out there stuff is actually beyond reason. It's mystical, it's advanced, more advanced. But you have to call that bluff, right? Because a lot of this stuff that is breaking the laws of conventional reason is actually pre-rational, right? It's actually a regression below the norms of reason in order to protect one's self-esteem and emotional stability and other things. Like, most people regress under pressure to pre-rational forms of justification. But there are some trans-rational ways of making sense of things that include categories like acausal, right? Non-local, which are not the result of not understanding reason and science, but the result of understanding reasoning and science all day, and then looking at the hyperobject and being like, sorry, science, you're not 100% of the story. So we have to make it clear when we're looking at the landscape, especially of these conspiracy theories coming out of the mouths of spiritual teacher types. You have to look at this stuff and say, is that pre-rational or is that trans-rational, right? Again, a beautiful Wilberian construct of the pre-trans fallacy, right? That they're both not rational, but not everything that's not rational is created equal. That there are things that are rational plus admitting to the ineffable, rational plus admitting to the acausal, non-local. But a lot of the stuff that I'm saying, which is coming out of the mouths of spiritual teacher types, is pre-rational. It's magical thinking. It's infantile cognition for the sake of basically self-preservation and in-group, out-group cueing, which is to say you're recruiting a cult around you who's willing to believe the same irrational stuff that you are, as a kind of an affront to the normies who you feel superior over. So anyway, it was nice to say that, because that's all happening out there, and it's been bothering me with that conspiracy theory stuff. Not that there are not conspiracies, and not that there are not trans-rational views of the pandemic. There are both of those things. But most of the stuff is pre-rational magical thinking to protect our identities. None of that stuff would have a place in a future like you're asking for, Amy, where we'd have a bunch of sovereign individuals. So what exactly that looks like the skin on the bones of the notion of the unique self symphony ends up getting into the work that I did on the 13 social miracles in my book. So in my book, I lay out these 13 social miracles, which I describe as the condition for the possibility of an education-centric or human-centric society. So that means that basically, if we want to have an economy going, and we're extracting resources from the earth, and we're building a planetary computational stack, why are we doing that? For the infinite accumulation of abstract, fictitious capital? That's a weird reason to do it. Why don't we do all that for the sake of humans, and specifically for the sake of the next generation? So the idea with the social miracles is that we could have the economy humming, and we could build in bells and whistles that end up routing the excess energy back into something like a temple of learning that's perched atop the entire economic stack. And that's that temple of learning that allows us to get all the people, the skills that are theirs to get, and then to get them into the situations in civilization where they're useful. And then you get the emergence of a unique self-symphony at a civilizational wide scale, but only if you have an education and human potential actualizing and routing system, right? But that's very complex. So you need to put a lot of resources into that, which means you need to figure out how to disentangle the fictitious capital that sits atop the actual productive economy, and then cycle the excess energy back into the human itself, so that the transformation of consciousness, the transformation of skill and identity and intergenerational transmission, that's the point of the whole economic socio-political thing. That's why we're doing this. But it looks like basic income guarantees, rethinking spatial borders, actually redrawing geographical boundaries between regions. It looks like a distributed, decentralized healthcare system of patient empowerment, health focus. It looks like eventual total planetary demilitarization. It looks like unity between all the world's religious traditions in trans-scientific Dharma alliance. So there's a lot. There's 13 of them. And that is all necessary for this new person to have the kind of like causal conditions and material realities to become real, just like all the stuff with modernity that we've come to know and love and then not like so much. All of that stuff allowed the modern person to be like, whoa, we each get a car, we each get a house, whoa, this is crazy. Like this is, all of that material accoutrements of the fiction of the modern person. We're going to need new material accoutrements to weave the imaginal person of the future. What would it be like to go to school knowing that you're entering an economy in which wage labor is not the dominant category? That's weird. So you're in school for 15, 18 years or something that looks like a school, but it's not training you for a job because wage labor is not the dominant category. There's a basic income, and there's other ways where people are making themselves useful, and it's this complex thing that doesn't look like what we know of as like a job market, right? Because you enter it voluntarily, right? So that's an example where different material accoutrements allow for different identity, like a different identity construction, different identity possibility. So that's just an example. Similarly, if you were growing up and you knew that the borders between countries were different than they are now, like before World War I, you could just go anywhere you wanted. People don't realize this, like passports and stuff, like, nope. You're just cruising around. I mean, there were some borders that were harder to get over than others, but there wasn't this incredibly complex infrastructure of border security, et cetera. So the question of to what extent you form your identity based on the idea that there are borders that you could never get across, right? What would it look like if you formed your identity knowing that there were no borders you couldn't cross, right? So again, concrete utopian theorizing is what it is. But we need that kind of social imaginal to think through what's possible for the identity. So yeah, thank you. Good questions.
So we have about 5 minutes left. Do you think we can sneak in one more question? Mm-hmm. And if we go over just a little bit, people can exit whenever they like. Maggie, you had a good question. If you can go on off mute and ask it to Zach.
Yeah, hi. This is really similar to a question above. So I want to maybe merge it since we have one last question. A couple people in the comment section was curious about, I guess, collective choice making and cooperative sense making. And I was really struck by your introduction of the hyper object kind of concept, and especially your kind of emphasis that we need to be aware of the limits of our instruments and not be captured by what Peter would probably call mimetic tribal silos. So I was curious if you had any practical suggestions or actionable ways that you think people could come together in this time to understand this pandemic hyperobject and sense towards how we should respond.
Totally. Let's see. I mean, the number one thing, I think, is being able to ask good questions about your immediate situation with other people who are in a similar situation. So it's like, you could ask good, super abstract questions about things that could never be confirmed, right? And sometimes we think this is sense making, but this is actually not sense making. Maybe eventually, and for some people it is, depending on their location, but for the vast majority of people, sense making is, how do I ask good questions about the situation that I'm actually concretely in? And so that would mean sitting together with people in your community or in your house and literally just creating questions together. And so this is something I picked up in my work with Forrest Landry. I've been working with him for a couple of years now, along with some others, building out collective sense-making apparatuses and research and other things. And one of the key things of all of our research is questions matter so much more than our supposed answers to them, that the majority of the sense-making struggle is actually finding the right question or sets of questions. So the creation of what I call question taxonomies, which are brainstorms. Groups come together and they brainstorm questions. And again, the goal is not to answer these questions in that meeting. The goal is to come up with questions, and the best, most precise, deepest questions together. And then you organize these questions into this taxonomy of questions, and then you look at it together. And you say, this is the stuff that we don't know. And the key thing with asking questions is to move beyond the questions that are rhetorical questions, right? Or that are questions, they're questions that it's really a statement, but it's like disguised as a question, you know? So you want to get to the real sincere questions about your immediate situation that you don't quite know the answer to, or you don't know where to answer at all, but you need an answer / want an answer. And then you can start moving into, how would I find the answers to these questions, and moving into the next phase of the process. But before you start trying to get a definitive set of propositions that tell you the state of affairs, you need to ask, well, what am I even looking for? Right? What would be the information that would most help me, given where I'm at, who I am, etc. So that's the kind of first tip, is actually keep it simple and focus on asking good questions together. And then from there, a lot will come. And, the epistemic humility is what should be dawning after the humiliation by the cognitive function of the hyperobject, which is to say, the right response is not throw up your hands and shrug and you can't understand it because it's a hyperobject. It's not the right response. It's continuing to move, but with a different frame, one that's got what I call epistemic humility, which means basically like knowing that you can't know it all, right? And actually knowing that you're always acting in a certain amount of uncertainty. And this is important ethically to know. Like, you have to hold yourself gently in these complex situations because you are making decisions without full knowledge, in contexts that often require almost heroic, like kind of forms of trade-offs. So yeah, the hyperobject is also a reminder that you're not the hero. Right? Like it's a deflating again of the modern ego, right? The modern ego is the hero. Figure it out, put a period on the end of that question, triumph, tame nature, win the game. Right? Like, nope, that has obviously not worked out well. So we're in a situation now where the hyperobject is actually forcing us into a different archetypal way of grappling out of the simplistic heroic narrative and into one that is, again, I think post-tragic, something redemptive, and something more about love than about conquest. So I'll end it there. Yeah.
Very cool. There is just one question someone just asked, and I really encourage you to feel free to swat it away, but I'll say it anyways. Can Zach confirm if he doubles as the lead guitarist in System of a Down?
I do not. I'm a bass player.
Okay. I'm glad that got resolved. Cool. So we're at the hour mark. Zach, thanks so much again for coming on the Stoa. Greatly appreciated. I'll post this on the YouTube channel so everyone can watch it. Upcoming events, I'll just mention one, a game about living boldly in a crisis with Joe Edelman. That's coming up at 2 p.m. Eastern time. Definitely check that out. And tomorrow we have Samo Berja with Institutions and Situational Awareness, a presentation on that, and a cool event with AJ Bond on the narcissistic spotlight, calling attention to our collective narcissism and building a relationship with it. That being said, Stoa is based off a gift economy. If you're inspired to provide a gift to the Stoa, which I'm viewing the Stoa as a gift to the world right now for us to freely use, just go to the website, thestoa.ca, and check out the gift economy at the bottom of the page. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for coming on today.